What's email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Ray Gallant, Vice President of Sustainability and Productivity Services at Volvo Construction Equipment. We pick up our conversation with Dr. Gallant talking about the strategies he employs to promote effective communication and collaboration amongst his team.
So I think everybody kind of knows the few basic communication themes. Communicate often and clearly, know your level of the audience and stay at that level. Like, don't try to go above or below their understanding of the topic. Always have the people you communicate with repeat the message back to you to make sure it's clear and it was understood. So those are kind of basic things. And, like everybody else, I'm always trying to improve my skills around those basics. But beyond that, I like Aristotle's modes of persuasion. If you go right back to your college days, the logos, the ethos, and the pathos modes of persuasion. So logos is, the logical argument. We do this because, and here's the facts that support the because. The ethos being the character and credibility of the speaker or whoever's trying to convince you to do it. And the pathos being the emotional argument. And the reason that's important is because all of us have a tendency to react to one of those, or two of those, and that's our comfort zone. But we've got to realize that other people may have a different comfort zone and a different language that they understand. So if you talk to a person who's emotionally motivated, by an emotional argument, and you try to tell them logic around why you should do something, you're not talking their language. You might as well be talking Spanish to them. So, I think it's very important that you always, in your communication, you always try to have elements of all three arguments if possible. And if you go back and look at the great speeches, the Martin Luther King speeches, the John F. Kennedy space exploration speech. Those speeches, you can pick out elements of all three modes of persuasion that are really well highlighted in those speeches. And that makes how powerful they are. So I'm always working to try to get that skill perfected and, make sure that I'm always using that. If I was left to my own comfort zone, I would talk to a certain type of person and probably be quite persuasive to them, but miss out totally on the other types of personalities. And again, what that's going to lead to is a non-diverse team that only views things through one lens, which is not what I want to have.
I missed that class. Hold on. What was that called? You didn't teach that at Georgia Tech. Pathos? No. We didn't have any of that stuff, man. I need to go back and pick up a book on that one. That's awesome.
Aristotle's modes of persuasion.
I'm going to have to pick that one up. I had never heard of that. And that's interesting to hear. And I do think you made a statement that I think is really important too. You're telling them what you want and you're asking them to repeat it back to you, and you're trying to make sure they understand the message that you're trying to get across, right? And then one of the challenges I think today is I tie a little bit back to what we just talked about with the remote work, everything being electronic with the tools we have at our disposal. I think I'm a big observer of human nature, and I think that people, they have this tendency to want to get things off their to-do list. They want to check it off their list and move on to the next item. And the easiest way that I know to get it checked off my list is if I send you a one-way communication on Slack or Jira or an email that says it's done. But if I actually picked up the phone and had a conversation or a dialogue, I might find out it's not done and I have to put it back on my to-do list. So I think people have this tendency to want to just default to one-way communications and hope I never hear from you again, as opposed to actually having that the way you described it was asking those clarifying questions of, do you understand what I'm asking? And do you have questions that I need to clarify? Because if you think back when you were a kid, I'm sure you played it in Canada as well as we did in the US, this game called Telephone, where each kid would, you had the first kid had a secret and there's like a line of kids, and what comes out of the last kid's mouth is not remotely close to what the first kid said. And unfortunately, that still holds true in the business world, where the message that I as a leader send out doesn't seem to get passed down each iteration the way that I expected it to. And then what gets executed maybe is not what I intended. And that's because there was no clarifying questions asked. It was just here's what they want. I interpret it through my own filters and biases and the way that I define things, and then pass it to the next person who does the same thing. And so the message gets mangled as it goes. So I think it's so important. I know you said it's one of those core things we should always do, but I don't think people always do it. And that is, don't assume your message is being delivered in the way in which it was intended. Do allow for a dialogue of, what do you think I said? What does that mean to you? And make sure that your message is being received in the way in which you intended.
And again, that's much easier when you're in a face-to-face situation. And our technology today tends to drive the opposite almost, because it's very easy to click and be done, to click and close.
And we want that. We want that. Mentally, we want that.
Trained to, one of the advantages of these productivity tools is you can do things very quickly. You can fire off a reply very quickly. But sometimes that's not necessarily the best path to take. We've all probably done replies very quickly that we wish we had a recall button.
And there is one in Outlook, but it doesn't work. So I've seen them all the time where it comes in, so-and-so would like to recall the message, but the message is still right there. So it's too late. Now I'm really interested to see what it says, because you wanted to recall it.
Yep, exactly.
And you talk about the Aristotle, and, one of the things I find curious that I 100% agree with what you're talking about is when I'm working with big groups, what I'll often see happen is all the engineers will sit together on one side of the room. And I think that's because they all speak the same technical language. They all understand each other. They all think Dilbert's hilarious, and they took differential equations in college and have that shared badge of honor, having survived it. And then on the other side, and there's usually a gap of empty space. Then on the other side, there'll be the marketing team. And I think that's because they don't really speak each other's language, so they're not really comfortable around each other. And yet, to be successful in a strategy, or my world in project work, you really got to pull people to put them on the same plane. And so if you've got people that are strategic, maybe you got to pull them down a little bit. And if you got people that are super tactical, maybe pull them up out of the weeds a little bit, put them on that plane to have that conversation and that dialogue. And I think that if I interpret what you were talking about with Aristotle and your learnings from that, that's really what you're talking about, is how do I talk with each group and make sure we have the same message get spread across?
And it's not necessarily pulling anyone down or pulling anyone up to the same level. It's talking to each of them in the language that they understand and that they're comfortable with, so that they buy in because they heard what they needed to hear. And then everything else can be dealt with later, if you will. Then you've at least got them on board and aligned towards the vision. Then we can worry about the details and where, it has to be a logical basis for it. That appeals to some people, but you also have to have the creative, artistic types in there to think outside the box and drive your team that way. So again, it's part of the building a diverse team means having those diverse worldviews and as a leader, you have a responsibility to be able to communicate with each one of them in a language they feel comfortable with. It shouldn't be their responsibility to adapt to your language. It should be the other way around if you're a good leader.
Yeah. I think one of the funniest experiences I had as a facilitator was, this was two engineers, and they were just nose to nose, spittle flying, arguing, and I was listening to what both were saying, and they were actually saying the same exact thing. They were just singing it differently. Mm-hmm. And so having to step in and go, wait a minute, let's just calm down a second. And, I'm making these names up now, but Joe, you're saying this, and Fred, you're saying that, and you're saying the same thing. You're just saying it two different ways, and then watching the red face come down. Oh, okay. So now they got to calm down because they were yelling at each other. Exactly. So you've been and continue to be involved in some super innovative projects that obviously are pushing the boundaries and looking at sort of setting new horizons. But anybody who's been involved in this kind of work knows this is never going to be a smooth process. There's going to be hiccups along the way. Can you talk about a memorable challenge that you and your team encountered, and how did you overcome that challenge?
So, if you look at innovative projects, so I think there's two types of innovations. Before I directly answer your question, I think there's two types of innovations that we have to distinguish here. So I like to think that we're always continually innovating and continuously improving our products. So those types of projects are normal, everyday business. The second type of innovation is what Clayton Christensen called disruptive innovation, which is what I think we're in this sustainability era and the sustainability journey that we're on and that I'm working in primarily now. So that's kind of the project that I say is memorable and is directly related to this, is that the new sustainability push and the new technologies coming up. Because in my opinion, by Christensen's definition of innovation, they are definitely disruptive innovations that are hitting our industry and hitting many other industries at the same time. So what Christensen said, and I agree with him, is that in a lot of times incumbent companies have a difficulty adapting to these new innovations purely because they have invested heavily in the old technologies, in plants, in factories, and everything that dealt with the old workflow, and in the knowledge of the old technology. So quite often what happens is they leave a gap for somebody to come in and do something using a new technology or new work method that is far more efficient than they are. But if you think about it, the incumbent companies in the industry have all the advantages. The trick is that they've got to recognize that these changes are going about around them, and that they have to react to the changes. If they wait to react to the changes or think that their strength and their position in the market will isolate them or insulate them from these new companies coming in, new entrants, that's just not a reasonable assumption if you look at history. So I like that viewpoint. It's threatening. It's alarming if you look at, the amount of money that's invested in technologies, and, now we got to switch and do something new. But that is the path of innovation. And there's all kinds of examples in history of industries and major companies that have failed simply because they didn't recognize that the technology and the needs of the market were changing to a new way of doing things or new work methods. So as an incumbent company in the industry working with Volvo, I think we have an excellent position to basically innovate and to lead. We have the competencies, we have the partnerships with other companies. So not only can we continue to develop and incrementally innovate our existing products, but I think we have an excellent opportunity to lead some of these new technologies in the future, and not be caught out. So, I'm kind of excited by this, and that's why I say this is a memorable challenge because it's going on right now, but it's definitely, this is an industry-changing disruption, which I think we have a good chance to thrive in. And I'd say that for Volvo and other industry companies. I'm very heartened by the way a lot of companies in the industry, in automotive, in trucking, in heavy equipment, are taking on this challenge and are not trying to push it away and ignore it. They're taking on the challenge and trying to come up with more sustainable products and technologies going forward.
Well, I'm sure that my kids appreciate that. So thank you on their behalf. So how do you've kind of answered this question already, but I'll ask it. And if if you think you've answered it already, we'll just move on. But when you're talking about communication, you're talking about innovation and the things we're doing, how do you ensure that your team members feel empowered to be able to contribute their ideas and opinions and have that culture of open communication? Because a lot of us, if I'm a team member and you're a vice president, maybe I'm a little bit cowed by the fact that my boss's boss is in the room and I may not want to not challenge you, but say, hey, we've done that before, it didn't work, or we just finished a project where that wasn't successful. I mean, how do you foster that open communication on these kind of projects?
So we have kind of talked about it a little bit, but in a nutshell, if you want to foster that environment where people are free to speak their opinion, you need to foster, first of all, their involvement. They need to be willing and able to be involved in it. You have to have a sense of belonging, that they know they're part of the team, they know they're valued part of the team, and why. Not just that they're, a butt in the seat, that they're there for a reason, and we need their expertise or their resource or their creativity on certain aspects. They need to have also a sense of security. So again, as I was saying earlier, the ability to be wrong and not to fear the consequence of being wrong, to take a chance, to try something new, to react definitely if it's not working, but they have to be secure in the fact that they can try something new and can go a different direction. And if you get those three things together, their willingness to be involved, their sense of belonging, the security, then you start getting ownership for them to start taking ownership in the project and the results and saying, yes, I contributed to that, or I want that to happen. I want that to be part of my legacy, part of my accomplishment at the end. So I think, that's the kind of environment that you have to build. And of course, the open, transparent communication is necessary. It has to include all those different elements of talking to the different people in the language they understand, they want to hear. But basically, as a leader, you're creating the environment. So it's not that you empower people by decree. It's you empower people because they want to be empowered and want to be involved. Dwight D. Eisenhower gave one of the best definitions of leadership that I've ever heard. And he said, basically the art of leadership is getting people to do what you want done because they want to do it. So it's not a matter of coercion. It's not a matter of, I'm your boss, I'm telling you what to do. It's a matter of them recognizing what has to be done and wanting to contribute and do it on their own. That's much more motivating than the previous example where I tell them what to do.
No, I totally agree. I'm learning a lot on this call. This is awesome. So are there any nuances for dealing with geographically dispersed teams? I mean, you've given a lot of good advice so far, but I'm just wondering if you take the additional challenge of maybe different languages. I mean, you're Canadian. I was born in the US. So even English is not the same for both of us, right? And when I traveled to the UK, it's amazing how far American English is from the native English. So now you add maybe Sweden or Japan or some other country in, and there's nuances there. Are there other challenges that you have to navigate through?
You mentioned the language challenges. That's always a barrier. And, I tip my hat to a lot of my colleagues in other countries because a lot of them are working in their second language. And you have to recognize that, for us, English as a first language, we're perfectly comfortable and we think in terms of English. But that's not true all around the world where you get into these different cultures. The other thing is, different cultures have different sensitivities and cultural biases is probably a bad word, but cultural leanings that are instilled into them through their upbringing or whatever. So you get some cultures are very hierarchical still. Some cultures have a very easy way to adapt to team dynamics. Others are very individualistic. So you get different cultural mixes. And I think that's something as a leader, again, you just have to be very sensitive to, just like there's different personalities on your team, you want to take advantage of those different cultural viewpoints. Not necessarily to come up with new solutions, but to make sure that you're looking at the problem from all worldviews and all possible solutions.
Yeah, I think it's hard to do though. I think as a human being, at least for me, I've been in rooms or places where if the boss was in the room, nobody would say a word because it's, like you said, very hierarchical. And then I've been other places where the culture is to challenge everything. And first you feel offended, like, wait a minute, why are you challenging me on everything? And so it's definitely took me out of my comfort zone in both of those situations because I'm a collaborative person and I didn't want to work with just one person. I wanted the team to contribute. And the other situation, I felt like everybody was attacking and that's not what I wanted either. So it's hard for me at least, it was hard to accept that and to be able to fix it.
And again, the realization, the epiphany is neither one is wrong.
No.
They're just different worldviews, different ways of behaving, different cultures that are driving that. So it's a matter of sitting back, being humble, and realizing, okay, this is why this is happening, and how do I want to adapt to it? Because again, if I'm working in somebody else's culture, it's up to me to adapt. It's not up to the culture to change to suit me.
Right. I wish everybody thought that way. Is there a project you've led or been a part of in your career that you're most proud of? And I'm sure the people who were not on that project will take offense to that answer, but what was it and what did you learn from your success?
I've been fortunate to have a lot of projects in my career where I've been able to launch, help develop, and then launch products that have gone on to be successful in the market. So I'm obviously very proud of that record going back. But right now you're starting to launch new products, but with new technologies as well, which is another dimension to it. So I'm really looking forward to these next few years where you take a traditional product, repower it with a new, a battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell or hydrogen combustion or whatever these new technologies that we're going to use in the next 5-10 years, and start launching those products into the market. And what's interesting about that is it's not only are you launching a machine or into a new duty application, you're changing the way the entire site will work in the future because the fuel systems also have to be brought into play. So with an electric machine, you got to figure out how to recharge it. It's not as simple as pulling up a fuel truck at 6 o'clock at night and refueling every machine. Now you've got to figure out how am I going to stagger the machines to make use of the chargers and the power I have available on site. Hydrogen the same way. Where's my hydrogen fuel source? How do I produce and get hydrogen to the machines if that's the way they're going to be powered? So I think that is something that I'm looking forward to in the next few years, and I think I'm going to, I know I'm going to look back on it with a sense of pride where we've been able to work through some of those challenges because they are significant.
I saw a video where you were interviewed and you were talking about the site think about the site like a manufacturing facility and the workflow changes and you're not trying to optimize each individual piece of equipment or cell. Now you're trying to optimize the flow and you're still, making differences. I can't remember the exact terminology used, but it's like you're still modifying the pieces as they go down the production line. It's on a site instead. And I thought that was eye-opening for me.
Yeah, it's optimizing an entire site, not trying to optimize each piece of the puzzle.
Right. So you kind of answered my next question as well as what excites you. That was clearly the future is exciting for you. So are there any goals you have for yourself and the company specifically and or the industry in the next 5-10 years?
So I think as we transition to these more sustainable technologies and the transition occurs throughout the industry, throughout society, I think my goal would be for the company would be to stay at the forefront of this, to keep a leadership position in our industry. So not only are we developing and help lead the industry through it, but coming up with the next innovations, the next refinements we need, and being part of that process. And for me personally, that's kind of a challenge and a goal I've set for myself to stay on top of this, because at the end of the day, sustainability is a balance between three sets of needs: the social needs, so what the people are asking for; the environmental needs, what we have to do to avoid pollution and ruining our environment and not being efficient with raw materials; and the economic needs. And I think for me, if we can find a balance between those three, and if I can help in that process to get solutions that satisfy what the people are asking for and what the workforce is asking for, satisfy the environmental concerns, but are also economically viable so we can afford to keep reinvesting and keep developing these technologies, then that for me is going to be a win in the next 40 years of my career.
The second 40 years. Got it.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up, I have three questions I'd like to ask everybody who comes on the show. First, are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
I like to lead by example. I think working hard is part of that example, but it's also part of a leadership principle. You've got to work hard. You've got to put the time in. You've got to better yourself to be a good leader and gain the respect. And speaking of that, I think respect is earned. So that's, again, a leadership principle I live by. You've got to earn the respect, and it has to be re-earned each and every day. You can't assume that because you reached a given position or been given a position, that the respect is automatically there every day. It doesn't work that way anymore. To that, the most important currency as a leader you have is the respect that the people have for you and your opinions and your direction, because that's when they decide to follow you. If they have respect and trust that you're going to take them in the right direction.
I think that's important no matter where you are, but it's certainly needed in a matrix organization where you can't make them follow you. So you've got to inspire them to say, this guy makes sense to me. He's somebody I want to be a part of his project, his strategy, whatever that is.
As I said earlier, because they want to do it.
Exactly.
That's the key.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, that's a good question. I would say the best piece of advice I've ever been given, and I always have a hard time following it, is basically to have fun. To enjoy what you're doing, to find, enjoyment and joy in whatever you're going to do in life or whatever task you have in front of you. Enjoyment is infectious, as is misery. So if you're miserable at your job, it's pretty hard to be an effective leader because you pass on that misery to everybody else. If you enjoy your job and you have a passion for it, that is equally infectious to your people. So I think that's good advice. I'm not sure it was given that way, but that's how I've come to interpret it over the years.
What's the best book or article you read recently? What was the key takeaway?
A couple of years ago, I read a book called The Last Lecture by Professor Randy Pausch. And it's basically, I didn't know this, but there's a series of lectures called Last Lectures where professors are asked to consider their mortality and reflect on what matters most to them in this lecture. And in the case of Randy Pausch, or Dr. Pausch, he was actually diagnosed with terminal cancer. And then so his lecture, rather than being a thought exercise, was a real exercise, because he's not only considering his mortality, he's living his mortality when he wrote this lecture. And the book is about, how he goes through that process. And the takeaway from it, which I love, is that, the accomplishments, what you do in your life is not as nearly as important as who you touch, who you affect, who you influence, and what you leave behind. So, life well lived is not necessarily a set of accomplishments. It's, what your legacy going forward will be in terms of those that you've touched and interacted with. So I think it's a good message and enjoyable book. Short book. It's an easy read, but a very profound book when you realize that this man actually had terminal cancer when this occurred.
Wow.
So.
Well, now I have 3 books to read after this call, so I got to get busy. So, Dr. Gallant, this has been really helpful and inspiring. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for being on the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.